Configuration Manager components and planning your installation. All right, this is really the second nugget in what I'll call the introductory videos associated with this Configuration Manager series. And while through the last 18 of these videos, we're going to be spending a lot of time really doing demonstrations and showing you the clicky that you need to go through in order to get your Configuration Manager system set up and your entire infrastructure set up, we're going to spend one more nugget here talking about the individual components associated with Configuration Manager and also just what you need to know in order to plan your installation. In this nugget, we're going to be talking about the individual components and all the different pieces that have to fit together for Configuration Manager to work properly. And also for those Configuration Manager servers, for those site servers, what are the different kinds of roles that you could potentially install to those site servers for enabling certain functionality. I think what you're going to find is that Configuration Manager is very extensible in what you can do with the individual site servers. And if you're not using particular roles, then you won't actually enable them in with your in those individual site servers. We're also going to talk about sites and their placement. We're not going to talk about the actual creation of site connections, though we'll do that much later down in nugget number 19. But we are going to talk about the role of sites and what sites need to be aligned with in terms of networks in order for them to be placed properly. And then lastly, we'll conclude with a little bit on what's new with Configuration Manager 2007. And if you're familiar with SMS 2003, what you can plan on seeing that is new and different between that and Configuration Manager 2007. So let's actually start by talking about the individual components that make up Configuration Manager. There are actually a number of different components, and really, in a lot of ways, these are sort of thought constructs for you to think about when you're considering how you want to plan your installation. Obviously, the boundary of any particular Configuration Manager site server is going to be the site itself. And a Configuration Manager site can relate to a number of different elements. It can relate to an IP address, for example, or an Active Directory site, for example. You can really bound how you want that outer boundary of your Configuration Manager, the reach of your Configuration Manager infrastructure to be based on that individual site. And within the Configuration Manager console, you're going to find different ways that you can actually bound those sites. And I'm going to show you actually here. If we go back, this is our Configuration Manager console, and we're not going to really talk specifically about the creation of sites here, but as you can see, we have specific boundaries that we can create based on IP subnet, based on Active Directory sites that allow us to bound our how far the reach of our Configuration Manager infrastructure is going to be by these individual sites. And you'll see also that we actually managed to bound by the Active Directory site or by the IP subnet to the specific Configuration Manager site 3-digit code. And so creating new boundaries is something that we're going to need to be able to do for each of the site servers that make up our infrastructure. Our infrastructure may have multiple site servers, and those site servers are going to service a particular site. And so when you're thinking about how you're going to position the site servers and the site systems in your Configuration Manager infrastructure, you're going to want to think about what your Active Directory site structure is and or what your IP site structure is. So if you have subnet boundaries that relate very directly to Active Directory sites, that may be a good target for you because those are considered well-connected locations. And in a Configuration Manager site system works very well when the clients that are talking to it have a very high level of network connectivity between the client and the server. You may find that having multiple sites actually makes things easier for you because then you don't have to distribute software, you don't have to distribute client policy, you don't have to really manage the inventory of those clients over a wide area connection. And so we'll talk in a minute about how you can set up those site hierarchies, but when you're considering the placement of your site servers and site systems, when you're considering where they're going to be on your network, pay very careful attention to the network connectivity between the site systems and the clients that they're attempting to service. Now, each individual site must have at least one site server. The site server is really the location which handles sort of the core of Configuration Manager. And a site system, it can be a site server, but a site server is always a site system. Multiple systems can be associated with a particular Configuration Manager infrastructure, and those site systems can be used to house various components associated with the processing of what it needs to do. So sort of here's a specific example associated with that. You may have a site server that includes the database for your site, that includes the management point for your site, but you may find that you don't have enough of processing capabilities on that site system in order for it to be able to handle all the management point functionality and handle all of the distribution point functionality. So it is entirely possible for you to create another site system that allows you to distribute the load. Let me go ahead and minimize this and show you again another example of how that works. You'll see down here under Site Systems, for the particular site, we have sccm Nugget that is created, and then we also have Nugget 1 that is created here too. You'll see sccm Nugget has a number of different roles associated with it, while Nugget 1 actually has been given a branch distribution point role. Now, the different roles can be spread apart amongst different systems in your environment. We are, for pretty much the most of the actual processing of this series, going to be talking about an environment that has a single site server and a single site system. But occasionally we may talk about adding in additional servers like this Nugget 1 for additional roles. Now again, this is we do this with a single server because it's easy to demonstrate. But when you go through the determination of where you need to set up the various components that make up your infrastructure, you may find that distributing out maybe a distribution point here to a file server, or distributing out another management point to this location for spreading out the load for clients, may help you so that you can better process those clients. What is important to recognize is when you're looking at the performance characteristics of those servers, when you see that certain elements are actually consuming too much resources, or when you send off an advertisement and that advertisement ends up consuming too many resources, you may find that you need to add additional site systems to distribute that load. So when you're thinking about planning out your configuration manager infrastructure, consider where you may position additional site roles, which we'll talk about in a second, to different site systems within a single site, so that you can better distribute the load of resources across what your clients are going to need to do. Now, in addition to distributing across a single site, we also have the concept of a site hierarchy. So you may have, for example, your site, which you're responsible for, which may have one or more site systems in it, and you may also have additional sites in other network locations. Those sites can be primary sites, those sites can be secondary sites, and those sites in those other remote locations can be used so that perhaps other IT organizations can manage that remote site, or so you can manage that remote site on behalf of the IT organization there. And depending on what you need to do with those sites will determine how you will configure your site hierarchy. Here in just a minute, we'll actually talk about how you can set up that site hierarchy depending on what you need to do. There also is the client. And arguably, the client is sort of the weakest link with Configuration Manager, because you have to have a Configuration Manager client that is installed on every system that you want to manage. And so, in some ways, really managing getting that client on the system is in a lot of ways the hard part, because what we're going to talk about is the process of setting up discovery that discovers all the resources in your environment. And then once you've discovered all those resources, you then need to get the client installed onto the resources that can be managed so that you can actually then pull inventory data. We'll talk in a future nugget about the difference between discovery data and inventory data. But what you're going to find is ensuring that that client is distributed across to the various systems in your environment is a very critical component, because you may miss some clients. You may miss some potential clients out there, and if you miss those potential clients, you are not managing those, and they may not be in your list of systems that you have the ability to manage. So the client is a very important component. We'll spend an entire nugget talking about distributing the client down the road. And the last, we have the management console as well. You know, we've shown the management console here and the various elements that make up that management console. There are ways that you can distribute that management console to people or give them components of that system management console. And so you're going to be finding yourself spending a majority of the time interfacing with your configuration manager infrastructure using this console. And the console in sccm 2007 is substantially improved over the console in SMS 2003. If you've played with SMS 2003, there were certain elements that there was a long delay in getting the element to actually expand. Using the element was sometimes complicated. And I think what Microsoft has done with the sccm console and Configuration Manager 2007 is really taken a lot of the input from the community to provide really a console that is very, very easy to use, very extensible, so you can do what you need to, and also then pass it around to other elements in your organization so that those other people in your organization, maybe they're help desk people or junior admin or administrators of other locations, can very easily make use of the console for specifically the things that they need to. Now, we talked about the concept of roles a little bit, and really I want to expand on that for what the different potential site system roles that you can assign to one or more computers in your organization are. And this is a list of really what those site system roles are. The major ones are here on the left. This is a site server itself, which is, again, that sort of primary server which handles the major components of the site itself. But we also have things like distribution points and management points and reporting points. Let me actually go down through this list to give you an idea of what you can expect when you see the different functionality, the different roles that a site server could potentially have. A distribution point is a location, more or less, much like a file share, where clients are going to point to actually get package code, or the source files, if you will, for an actual advertisement. And so when we talk about distributing software later on, you're actually going to identify a distribution point where that software is going to be located so your clients know where to go to get it. Multiple distribution points can be assigned for any particular site, and you may want to do that so that clients can then distribute what server they're attempting to pull those files from. A management point is a tool that is used for actually communicating with your clients. And if you have a large number of clients, you may need multiple management points, but those clients are going to work with that management point to input in their data, to input in their inventory data, and to get policy from the site itself. A reporting point is used as more or less a web server that is used for actually looking at the data, looking at the database, and completing reports based off of queries that you create. When you create a reporting point, which is something you need to do for each site, when you create a reporting point, you're creating a location that actually allows you to run reports and run queries and present them in a web-based format. And we'll talk about reporting in a later nugget, but this is the tool you're going to have available for you to be able to create reports and work with reports. A server locator point is used in certain situations where you don't have an extended Active Directory schema. This server locator point is used by the clients in finding the configuration manager infrastructure. Now, the clients have a couple of different ways in which they can actually find your infrastructure. One is using your server locator point. The other is actually extending the Active Directory schema and using Active Directory as the location for helping the clients find the servers. The reason why the server locator point is around is because some environments may have some heartburn associated with extending that Active Directory schema. If you've ever had a big problem with getting a schema extension put through, you're familiar with this problem. And so if you have that problem, you don't want to extend the schema, you can actually use a server locator point for the process of helping the clients find your configuration manager infrastructure. Obviously, a database server works with a site server because each site is going to have a single database, and that database is going to be the database of record where all the stuff is stored about all the inventory and discovery data associated with each of the clients. We also have a number of additional, and I will almost call them optional system roles that you may use depending on what sorts of functionality you're going to provide for that particular site. Now, I'm using a few acronyms here, but bear with me on here because the slide's only so big. We have the device management role, which is used when you have device management in your organization. You want to actually manage individual devices. This actually provides the functionality for working with those devices. We have a Pixie service point if you're actually pushing out OS deployment, if you're pushing out operating systems using Configuration Manager, and you want to use Pixie as a mechanism for booting those and getting the WinPE components installed for the pre-installation environments, you can use a Pixie service point. We have a software update point, which is an integration between Configuration Manager and WSUS for actually downloading the WSUS components and working with WSUS to push out software updates to your different clients out in your environment as well. We have a system health validator point, which is part of a NAP infrastructure, Network Access Protection infrastructure, which is used for when you have those software updates, ensuring that those software updates are on the clients before you will allow them to communicate with the rest of the network. And we'll talk about NAP in a later nugget as well. And then we have a state migration point, which is used during OS deployment for assisting with the process of migrating personality data or state data from one computer to the other when you're going through an OS deployment. And so these are some site system roles that are available. If we take a look here at the available site systems we have, I'll show you sccm Nugget has a number of these site system roles already configured with it. And throughout the process of this series, we're going to be looking at these individual points. We're going to be adding these individual roles to our site server so that we can take a look at what these roles are and the functionality associated with each of these roles as well. Each of these roles also has some characteristics that we may need to configure, and we'll talk about those in each of the specific nuggets associated with those individual roles. Now again, the processing of most of these roles is really important to have when you have, again, a well-connected network, when you have a well-connected infrastructure there so that your clients and your servers can talk to each other over a very fast network. But in some cases, you may have different sites available. You may have different Active Directory sites, or you may have different network sites in your organization that have clients in them, and those clients still need to be part of your configuration manager infrastructure. You can actually use different constructs between primary and secondary sites to create what we call a site hierarchy. And you'll see here I have a number of different boxes, and those boxes in some cases are attached to little database icons here. And what we're showing here is a different way that you can set up a site or your sites to create a hierarchy. You'll see up here at the top we have this little letter C here based on this server for what we call the central server. A central site is essentially the site that is at the top level of your site hierarchy. A central site has a database. That central site can point to either primary or secondary sites for the processing of client information. A primary site will have a database that is attached to it. It will have its own SQL database. And a primary site is often used when you have other IT organizations or other IT personnel at that remote site that need to be able to work with the configuration manager infrastructure. They need to be able to create their own customizations and push their own packages and do the things that is required of having your own site. But at the same time, although that you want them to be able to do the things they need to do locally, you want to push their data up so that you have a central location for that data. So whereas you may be creating packages, you may be creating collections up in the central site, the collections will actually flow downward to primary and secondary sites, but the inventory data, the discovery data will flow upwards. The difference between a primary and a secondary site is related to whether or not that local database and that local control is going to be available. A secondary site, conversely to a primary site, is not going to have that local control. It is more or less a proxy, if you will, for the clients that are in that remote site. And so if you have clients in a remote site, you're not going to have local people that are going to be working with the configuration manager infrastructure. You more or less just want to extend your ability to manage that site into that remote site. You can create a secondary site. There's going to be no database associated with it. If you want to create a local site with a local database, you can create a primary site. And primary and secondary sites can interconnect, as you see here, to create that full site hierarchy. And again, base this off of that capability of network connectivity. When you have that site hierarchy developed, you will find that all of the data that you've actually collected here into these lower sites will eventually make its way up to that central site. And so what you create at that point is a central location with all of the data across your entire organization where you can create reports against, where you can view your compliance statistics against. When you have that one central database of record of all of the discovery, all the inventory data related to your infrastructure. What this provides, again, is a great central location for you to create the reports that you need to report that on up to your management. Now, for most of the rest of this series, we're actually going to talk about the instance where we have nothing but a single site here. We're actually going to use just a single site because for our purposes, working with a single site is actually very easy. It's easier to demonstrate. Towards the very end, I believe in the 19th nugget in this series, then we're going to talk about how you can actually go through the process of connecting these sites together. What you need to create, these sender addresses that need to be created between secondary and primary sites or between primary and central sites so that they actually are aware of each other. But for the most part, we're going to be talking about a single site for the most of the rest of this because that's what's important for the small single unified network where you have one location. The last thing we want to talk about in this particular nugget really has to do with what's new in Configuration Manager 2007. And I put up here the acronyms not only because of limited space on the slide, but also so that you're aware of what these acronyms are, because you're going to need to search for them perhaps on the internet if you have problems later on, or be aware of what the acronym is so people can you can communicate with other people. Now we have Desired Configuration Manager, which is not necessarily new, but is now integrated in with Configuration Manager 2007 and is not an optional add-on pack. What Desired Configuration Manager does is it looks at the clients that you have assigned to it, and it looks at them in relation to a desired level of configuration. Maybe you know that you want a registry key to be a certain way, or a particular file to be a certain way. And when that client deviates from that desired configuration, you're going to get a report. Now, if you think about it, you've got maybe compliance, or you've got maybe a security that you want to make sure that your security configuration is set just so. When the clients deviate from that baseline configuration, you want to know so that you can fix the problem. And that's what DCM is designed to do. Also new with Configuration Manager 2007 is an integration with network access protection. If you're unfamiliar with network access protection, more or less what this is it is a solution for when computers come into your network. If you are going to require some statement of health from those computers, before you're allowed to give them a network interface or a network connection into your infrastructure. And so think about when you have maybe a laptop that leaves your domain and goes out into Starbucks somewhere, and then that laptop comes back. If that laptop doesn't have, for example, its antivirus turned on or its anti-spyware turned on, and if its updates are up to date, if it has the correct patches installed, well, you may not want to give it full access into your network. And that's what NAP actually allows you to do, is prevent those clients, those unhealthy clients, from getting on your network until they're actually remediated and they're completely healthy. We have Wake on LAN capability in Configuration Manager. If your network cards and if your network infrastructure supports Wake on LAN, you can actually now wake up those clients out of various standby states before you attempt to push packages to them or push updates to them. We now have the ability to work with clients based on the internet. And back in the very last nugget, in nugget number 20, we're going to talk about how you can use a PKI infrastructure to further secure your communication so that you can work with those clients across the internet. We have OSD, Operating Systems Deployment. And again, this isn't necessarily new with Configuration Manager, but what OSD allows us to do is deploy operating systems. It is now integrated directly into the interface without being a separate plugin, so that you can deploy those operating systems. And I think what you'll find if you used OSD in 2003, the OSD interface with 2007 is way, way, way better. We have mobile device management. If you have mobile devices on your network, you can actually manage those mobile devices as clients as well. We have software updates, which is now integrated with WSS, the Windows Server Update Service. And what software updates allows you to do is push patches and push updates to your clients through a very easy to use interface. If you're used to the ITMU, if you're used to the previous versions in SMS 2003 for deploying updates, I think you're going to be really excited about how the software updates components have been integrated in with Configuration Manager 2007. We have a new tool called Maintenance Windows. If you've dealt before with the problem of really identifying when patches and updates and change events should occur on clients, this concept of Maintenance Windows allows you to identify a specific window of time when clients are allowed to actually do those change events and software updates and those sorts of things. This is a great boon for administrators if you only have a specific window that you can actually make those changes, because you can now identify what that window is going to be. We have VSS support for backups, and what VSS support allows us to do is much more assuredly ensure that our backups happen whenever we attempt to back up our site. With better backups, then we know that if we have a crash, we'll have better restores. And we also have backup distribution points, or branch office distribution points. And these branch office distribution points are in situations when we may have our hierarchy and we don't want to put, for example, a secondary site into a very small location, a location with a few number of clients, but we do want to name perhaps a workstation, for example, as a location where we will store files as a distribution point. And so this branch office distribution point allows us to extend the reach of our Configuration Manager infrastructure without having to buy additional servers. And so this is really what we wanted to talk about in this nugget. Again, not too many demos at this point, but really you want to have some thoughts about the different components and roles and the things you need to be aware of when you're considering the planning of your Configuration Manager infrastructure. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.